Thank you so much, Shoshana, and thank you everyone who has joined our presentation today. So before I pass it off to our presenters, I do want to do a quick introduction just so you all have a little bit of understanding of their background. So Dr. Alfia Batalova is an assistant professor in the School of Humanitarian Studies at Royal Roads University in British Columbia. With a PhD in disability studies and a master's in public administration, she brings years of experience working with disability and health nonprofits. Her research focuses on community engagement, disability, and social policy, and she's published widely in journals such as Qualitative Health Research and Disability in Society. As a disabled scholar, Dr. Batalova centers disability justice in both her research and community work. And our other presenter, Anu Pala, is an accessibility professional with over 2 decades of experience working with businesses and community-driven organizations. She holds a BA in Professional Communications from Royal Roads University and a diploma in Rehabilitation and Disability Management from Simon Fraser University. Her key areas of work have been in digital accessibility, career development, and training. Anu also has a background in the radio, television, and podcasting industry. Through her work, Anu has been instrumental in shifting perceptions about disability in the workplace, education facilities, and beyond. Her work is informed through her lived experience of sight loss and passion for creativity. And with that, I want to go ahead and pass it over to our first presenter, Alfia Batalova. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Before we begin, I would like to start with self-description. I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing glasses and a striped white and blue shirt. As Amanda mentioned, I do bring a lived experience of disability, and this experience informs the topic we will be discussing today and my connection to the disability issues more broadly. And I would like to pass it over to Anu to describe herself.
Thank you so much, Alfia. Good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, my name is Anu Pala. I go by she, her pronouns, and today I'm logging in from my home office in White Rock, British Columbia. And a brief description of myself. I'm a South Asian woman with dark shoulder-length hair and hazel-colored eyes. And today I'm wearing a pink blouse and gold accessories. My work is informed by my lived experience of sight loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Anu, and we'll hear from you soon. I'd like to start with just describing a little bit about how our collaboration came about. Anu was actually a research participant on the research project that I was leading. And as I learned more about Anu's background, I wanted to work together on something creative. I don't think this project would have happened if it wasn't for Anu's experience in media, in producing podcasts, and understanding accessibility on a deep level. A note about the language. As a scholar in critical disability studies, I will be using the terms disabled people and people with disabilities interchangeably to recognize a variety of ways in which people identify and navigate the world. Okay. So the project that informed the development of the podcast was conducted in 2021, 2022, when I was doing my postdoctoral work at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And the project originated from community consultations with local governments and disability organizations, and was part of a larger partnership titled Inclusive Mobility and Participation. And you're seeing a link to the project in the chat. And it explores the issues of accessibility in the built environment, transportation, and social accessibility, so policies, programs, and services. And so it became evident that public engagement and the ways in which people with disabilities participate in their communities has rarely been explored. Yet the principle "nothing about us without us" that speaks to the instrumental role of disabled people's voices in the decision-making processes should be at the core of how programs are developed and decisions that impact disabled people are made. However, we know it's not always the case, and it's not always easy to translate this principle into practice. And so we decided to look at the accessibility advisory committees that are part of the Municipal Government Advisory Network as a case study for diving into this area. And so we worked with more than 10 municipalities in the province of British Columbia. And according to Statistics Canada, as of 2022, 28.6% of British Columbians had at least one disability. Another important point to make here is that British Columbia at the time was in the process of developing its provincial accessibility legislation. And even though the committees existed in many communities before the legislation, the Act made it a requirement for all the local governments to have a committee. So there's an increasing acknowledgement of the importance of direct involvement of people with disabilities in policy development. And advisory committees are part of that. Citizen involvement has a number of positive effects on democracy. Not only do people feel more responsibility for public matters, they're encouraged to listen to a diversity of opinions, and this in turn contributes to a higher degree of legitimacy of the decisions made. Processes that create barriers and do not elicit the two-way communication devalue citizen participation. And the use of inauthentic methods create resentment, separation, and between the city officials and citizens. And there has been an increasing body of research that focuses on the value of the knowledge that disabled people bring. Researchers use the term epistemology of embodiment, fancy term, but what it means is that this is a unique way of knowing rooted in how disabled body minds move through and interact with the world. People with disabilities contribute knowledge and understanding informed by that lived experience. And advisory committees help advance this expertise by experience. The image on the slide is the image from the International Association for Public Participation. And it's a spectrum of public participation that starts from a very basic level of engagement, level of informing people. And obviously this level does not have any sort of two-way communication or expectation for feedback. And then it moves up to consult, then involve, collaborate, and empower, with empower being the most engaging and empowering way of working with people. And so this framework really kind of helps to understand where accessibility advisory committees fit. Oftentimes we found in our research that they operate at the consult and involve level. We haven't found examples of empower, unfortunately. But again, this kind of helps to understand the mandate of these committees. And so what have we learned through talking to people? So the research questions that we wanted to pose is questions around just the experiences of people serving on the committees, because we didn't necessarily know much about this. It's often perceived as not very exciting area of research. We wanted to understand the role of these committees in the municipal policymaking process, whether it contributes to accessibility changes, things like built environment, transportation, policies. And more broadly, we wanted to learn about the civic participation and advocacy of people with disabilities through these committees. So a little bit about our methodology. So we worked with 14 municipalities. So some municipalities had joined committees. So so there might be less committees, but a total of 14 municipalities. We conducted interviews with committee members and city staff, mostly through Zoom, because it was in the midst of COVID. And we managed to talk to 33 participants, mostly people with disabilities serving on the committees, but there were a few city staff who contributed their perspectives on the process as well. So what have we learned? And again, this is not a webcast that focuses on the research findings, but it does help us understand how it informed our thinking about the podcast, the questions we want to address. So some of the themes that I wanted to highlight include the theme around finding a voice on the committees. So this theme describes how people with disabilities were navigating the process of how to voice their concerns, how to share their experience of living with a disability, how to navigate the whole process of advising the city, because there's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of specialized language that municipalities use that people might not know about, the urban planning language. So it was a bit of a process. The second biggest theme was around the challenges that people experienced serving on the committees. And a lot of these challenges had to do with the procedural aspects. Some participants shared frustrations about, a perception that some municipalities were claiming that they're committed to accessibility in theory, but in practice, there was a sense that they're not doing much. There was a lot of kind of lip service. They were not willing to go beyond the bare minimum, the compliance language. There was not necessarily a lot of feedback in terms of how the information shared was used. So still very poor communication that people shared with us about. So a lot of the sense of tokenism, that they're there just because they kind of have to be there, but they're not necessarily engaged in a meaningful way. And then the final theme engages with the idea that accessibility as a concept, as a policy issue, is very complex. And one of the complexities of accessibility relates to kind of what role it plays in the discussions around equity, diversity, and inclusion. Even though most of the terms of reference that we've looked at for the committees provided a specific definition of what accessibility means, the interviews reflected that it's not as clear cut, and it's still challenging to think about accessibility in an, for example, intersectional way. So in British Columbia, the issues around truth and reconciliation, for example, are very important. And so how do the experiences of someone who is Indigenous and disabled, how do they impact someone's life? So these are still very challenging questions that municipalities are grappling with. And so these themes were helpful for us in developing the questions for the podcasts. They gave us some time to reflect. And so we then went into this knowledge transfer journey where we wanted to make sure that we continue talking to and reflecting on the findings of the research. So, the first thing we did was we developed a community report where, again, we wanted to share the findings. That would be helpful to municipalities, but also to the research participants. And also, I was able to attend some of the community events with local community organizations like Spinal Cord Injury BC, for example, where I was able to share some of the findings. However, it seemed like something was still missing there. And I wanted to unpack the findings more, expand the questions, and integrate a focus on storytelling. And I think that storytelling component was there in terms of the stories people shared, but it wasn't necessarily as nuanced. And so we know that storytelling is foundational to podcast. Stories are a powerful medium for conveying meaning, knowledge, and understanding. And podcasts allow us to focus holistically on things like, culture, politics, relationship. And so storytellers can tell stories that resist the dominant narratives. In terms of representation, audio storytelling methods of inquiry have the potential to kind of move beyond the limitation of the written text in academia, allowing listeners to encounter the subtle dynamics and texture through maybe things like speaker's voice, how certain emotions are conveyed. In terms of accessibility, podcasting reflects the idea that knowledge is a collective benefit, and the sharing of knowledge is both a responsibility of research and a form of advocacy. As a method of knowledge mobilization and dissemination, podcasting provides an engaging and informative medium for bringing research to a wide audience in a flexible and accessible way, as long as, of course, we avoid technical jargon, context-specific jargon. There's a concept of epistemic justice. I use that term again, epistemic, because I think it speaks to the value and of the voices that have been historically marginalized. And it can help us expand the breadth and depth of co-creating knowledge. And finally, public scholarship. It's also quite central. What does it mean for us to promote knowledge? What does it mean for disability justice? How do we continuously ensure that disabled people, their lives and histories are represented in spaces that are not made accessible to them? And how can academics researching and writing about disability engage with disabled communities? So this is an opportunity for me, for sure, to engage with some of these questions and to continue thinking about them. And now I would like to turn it over to Anu to talk a little bit about the meat of the process and the podcast planning and how it all worked for us.
Thanks, Sophia. So there are many things to consider when planning a podcast, and today I'm going to share what has worked for me. I've been producing podcasts for over 5 years now, so I've learned a lot along the way. A good place to begin is by having a clear understanding of the focus and vision of what you want your audience to get out of your podcast. In our case, we were sharing the outcomes of Althea's research. So once we've identified our focus and vision, we need a hook. The hook is what will attract potential listeners to your podcast. So think about what separates your podcast from others. Our hook was unpacking the internal workings of civic engagement, municipal politics, and how persons with disabilities contribute to that work. We know that whatever decisions are made at the local level impact everyone, including people with disabilities. So, for example, built environment, transportation, and services. So we hope that bringing the topic of civic engagement among persons with disabilities will provide some inspiration and fuel to current and future disability advocates, municipal governments, and allies. So back to the process. Once you have your hook, you need to identify your audience. In podcasting, it helps to have a niche so that your podcast can reach the right audience. So think about demographics like age, profession, and allies. For us, it was important to target the disability community, civic staff, and people who care about disability inclusion. And then we thought about what this podcast would look like. So, in terms of the number of episodes, duration of each episode, and who our guests would be. We decided to keep the series short, so we had 4 episodes at approximately 30 minutes each. We invited 3 guests with 3 different viewpoints and represented 3 different sectors. We had a city councillor, a city staff member, and an accessibility committee member and advocate. One of the reasons why we chose to create a limited series rather than an ongoing podcast was due to our limited budget. So when we look at a podcast budget, we usually look at the producer's time, hardware, software, incidentals, and other costs like that. So for example, marketing, administration, communications. Since I've been producing podcasts for over 5 years, as I mentioned, I have already built my studio. Therefore, we saved costs on purchasing equipment. So as a result, the majority of the funds went towards my time. In terms of recording the podcast, my personal preference is to record in person, but since we live in different places and have busy schedules, we decided to record virtually. Today, we have a number of platforms that can produce high quality podcasts like Riverside, just to name one. In our case, we went with Zoom for its ease of use and comfort level for everyone. Some of the other logistics that we had to think about were things like where would the podcast live? There are numerous platforms where you can upload and distribute your podcast, but we went with YouTube as there is no cost to create the channel. It is completely accessible and can be accessed by anyone. And side note, now we know that YouTube is the most popular platform where people are accessing their podcasts. Now, I love all aspects of podcasting, but post-production in particular is what I really enjoy as I get to use my technical skills. I thought I'd share what it takes to build a podcast or complete a podcast from the post-production side of things. But first, I create a master folder on my laptop so that everything is contained in one place. Then I create subfolders. So for example, audio files, artwork, scripts, and anything else that may entail related to the podcast. Then I download the audio tracks and save them in the appropriate folder. Usually files are created on separate channels, so There's a reason for this because it helps to get the best sound quality. Then I mix the audio tracks and create one file and save it by giving it a name with mixed unedited at the end. So you'll notice this is key. So first I create a file called mixed unedited. Then I save the same file again with the same name and change the end to edited. So now this becomes my working file where all the edits take place. Once all the edits have been completed, I add the pre-recorded intro and outro and then save it again with the same name. And only this time I change the end to final. So after completing that process, I do my accessibility checks. So I check for clear audio, create a transcription, and make sure that there's alt text on the artwork. And I'm going to
Yes,
pass it back to Alfia for a second.
thank you, Anu. Yes, I wanted to say a couple of things about the artwork and the importance of artwork in creating this podcast. So I wanted to kind of say huge thanks to JAG Nagra, Nagra, a visual artist who developed the artwork for the podcast. It was really important to have someone who can translate your ideas into a visual form. We considered two versions that were very different from each other, but we went with the image we have here on the slide because of its simplicity, the idea of layered speech bubbles, and the central place of our voices, the text on it. So having that and the color contrast was kind of some of the reasons we went with this visual. And in terms of the marketing, we're still early on in the process because we launched this podcast about 3 or 4 months ago. So it's an ongoing process, and the value, it's still relevant. It changes at the municipal level do not happen over time, so we definitely have time to reach out to new audiences. But we identified a few groups that we wanted to share a podcast with, groups in our network. Obviously, I have groups that I'm affiliated with in the research community. We definitely reached out to the industry, like accessibility advisors and consultants who also helped us promote. We are in the process of scheduling an interview with Accessible Media Inc. And yeah, so we're still discovering new ways to promote the work, to keep the conversation alive. For us, every time we promote, it's an opportunity to keep the conversation going. So yeah, so that's something I wanted to mention about marketing. And moving on to the next slide, talking about plan versus reality. Not sure, Anu, do you want to?
Yeah, absolutely. So while every plan aims to go according to schedule, the reality is that life happens. Since Alfia and I are working professionals and usually are juggling multiple projects, including family and our own disability management, we had to take these factors into consideration. So living with disabilities come with its own set of challenges. So for example, fatigue, technical challenges, and unexpected barriers. So through this experience, we learned, or at least I did, that it is important to create realistic timelines and be true to yourself about your disability needs. So managing fatigue, pain, and other issues. that affect us and how these factors can impact the completion of a project. This is not always discussed, but we wanted to be open and honest about the realities that many disabled professionals face.
Yes, thanks, Anu. And that definitely impacted our timelines, what we planned, when we wanted to complete it. The project, we had very ambitious plans, but yes, like Anu mentioned, it just couldn't be done. And I think it's important to talk about it because yes, there's lots of expectations that this is just getting done, but not a lot of discussions about what it takes. And so yeah, we just wanted to bring that up. So we wanted to give you a taste of, and not just talk on and on, but wanted to give you a taste of what our guests on the podcast were sharing. And so we prepared three very short audio clips, and then just share our thoughts about each of these small clips. All right, so maybe let's start with the first one. So our first guest was Amy Amanti, who was on the accessibility committee for a number of years and still a very strong disability advocate. And so we just wanted to share her clip.
Access begins with A. We talk about it at the very beginning of everything, right? Access is good for everyone. So it's not just about people with disabilities. Access is good for everybody. And so I think that what you're talking about, Tony, in terms of baking it into mandates and policies and principles is absolutely what needs to happen. And second to that, like built environment obviously is important, making sure our structures are accessible, but how do we now look also at making our programs accessible? Where's the social accessibility in these things, right? So if I come into the rec center and it's great that I can access, say, a pottery class because they have lowered sinks or, some of those things built in, how now do the instructors work with me on a level that is dignified as somebody with an accessibility? How do they speak to me in a dignified way? How do they translate or adapt their teaching methods to somebody who's blind or partially sighted? All of those pieces. How do we institute those things? Because for me, there's access and inclusion. And those two things they're different. They're married, they're in a relationship, but access is about, for me, access is like, can I get into the space? And inclusion is about who talks to me and how do I feel when I'm in that space?
Participate in dignity.
Yeah. Access plus inclusion equals equity.
Yeah, there's a famous for me phrase that kind of goes along the lines, you can't legislate morality. Like you can certainly put in place certain standards, but when it comes to social accessibility, like you said, Amy, it's not as easy.
All right, so here our guest really unpacked the idea of accessibility and inclusion, and what I mentioned before about passion, something that's not necessarily easy to convey through a paper. I think it's certainly very palpable to hear that from Amy, and so she speaks to what it means to feel that when you belong, that idea of belonging, dignity, and respect, and unpacking the challenging area of shifting the attitudes. So yeah, that was quite powerful. So we'll move on to the next audio clip, and this is Tony Valenti, who is a city councilor, District of North Vancouver. And yeah, let's hear what he has to say.
A lot of the snowfall clearing in a lot of cities is very focused on motor vehicles, and I would say is totally focused then on generally able-bodied people being able to get around. And we know that, as a generalization, like people with disabilities tend to depend more on public transit. So ensuring they have a clear walkway to get to public transit is absolutely critical. That's another area where we need to kind of focus on sidewalk clearing. And I know there's been a lot of work in the district of North Vancouver to ensure like homeowners are clearing in front of their places as required by the bylaw and actually doing that so that people have access to public transit. At the end of the day, like all of this stuff really comes back to listening and understanding and taking the time to do that. Given like the focus on equity, there are a number of studies coming out now, and I think there is an understanding that if we want to do things right, like we do need to work together and we do need to find those compromises. I think that's what Amy and I were kind of testing out, all those years ago and actually setting a kind of a foundation for. And I think that's what needs to continue to do this. And yeah, we can write a lot of great plans and a lot of great legislation, but if it doesn't help people actually get access and that inclusion, it's kind of all for nothing.
Yeah, I found it very powerful that Tony again talked about sometimes the disconnect between the legislation and the practice. And it was very important for us to have a speaker who has awareness about the flaws in terms of how the cities address issues around accessibility. I think his perspective helps build awareness for other counselors, people who are doing similar work, and build capacity among municipal leaders to incorporate an accessibility lens into the city services. And so, okay, and the final audio clip we wanted to share was from a staff who works as a planner in the city of Vancouver, Karen Lai.
Well, our council passed the accessibility strategy phase 1 last summer, July 2022, and based on community engagement that we did, one of the top things is about attitudes, how we shift attitudes and transform a culture shift. So that's something exciting about is that, and speaking of a person from a lived experience of disability, shifting attitudes is number one foundation, and then everything will follow.
It's a challenging task, though.
Absolutely. Because attitudes, way of being is so innate and ingrained in us. And how do we shift our own biases and assumptions and stereotypes?
Yeah, so Karen here talked about the continuous work around accessibility, and we cannot assume that once the legislation is in place, the work is done. And so I think the speaker, again, common theme here, common thread around social accessibility and shifting the attitudes and bias and addressing bias in a systemic way. So something that needs to be viewed as an ongoing conversation. So we'll move on to the next slide. So coming full circle. So Anu, I'll turn it over back to you.
So typically, when we evaluate a successful podcast, we look at numeric outcomes like number of downloads, likes, subscriptions, and shares. However, they don't tell us whether the podcast actually impacted listeners in some meaningful way. So when we shared the podcast link with our circles, we also shared a link to a brief questionnaire. This helped us connect to our listeners and determine whether the podcast resonated with them. So I'm going to share a quote that we heard from one of our listeners. Wow, great podcast. it was so interesting to hear from a variety of perspectives from accessibility champions. I really appreciated learning about how complex it all is. It is great to hear about how both municipalities and communities are working together to help shift both attitudinal and physical barriers. So that really showed us that this is landing for people. And this is a person who does not work in the accessibility field or in municipal government or anything like that. It was just somebody who we would consider like an ally or a supporter. So it was really great to receive that feedback. And our hope is that this podcast will keep the conversation going within their circles and beyond.
Thank you, Anu. All right, so there's a lot of things we touched on today, but as we wrap up, I just wanted to reiterate a few important points that might be helpful in your work as you think, as you consider creating a podcast. So the podcast for us became not just a different way to present the research findings, but actually a medium for generating new knowledge. I think through these discussions and conversations, more nuanced conversations came out. So by discussing some of the research findings through podcasts, the participants added new perspectives, posed new questions, and gave us new ways to think about the topic. The podcast allowed us to convey the aspects of the topic that are, as I mentioned, hard to convey through a written word. In terms of logistics, whatever timeline you have in mind, extend it because there are things that are outside of your control, and it doesn't only relate to disability, it can relate to a number of other things. You cannot be an expert on everything. So a learning for me was just being patient with myself. It's okay to make mistakes along the way. I made a lot of mistakes related to equipment and the use of equipment, but I'm really grateful to Anu for helping me navigate those challenges. And we also find it very valuable to kind of start engaging in the conversations to understand how the message of the podcast resonates with different audiences. And yeah, so those are some of our takeaways for this work. And with that, I would like to finish. And yeah, this is our contact information. And happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our presenters. And really quickly, I forgot to self-describe earlier, so I just want to do that really fast. So I'm a white female wearing a periwinkle blue shirt. I think that's what this is called. And I have long red hair. So again, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. I definitely learned a lot about podcasting, listening into you all. So again, for our attendees today, if you have any questions for our presenters, please feel free to put those in the chat or unmute yourself and go ahead and ask those. And while we wait for folks to start populating the chat with their questions or to come off mute, I actually do have a few questions of my own that I want to go ahead and ask you all. So I'm kind of curious. So for one question or for one podcast, how much time would you say roughly does it take from ideating, finding presenters, to recording it, to editing it, to posting it? So how much time could someone roughly estimate for that?
That's a really great question. And I would say it really varies on a few things. Depending on the duration of your podcast. So, for example, let's use the 30-minute mark. For a 30-minute podcast from beginning to end, I want to say approximately somewhere around 8 hours. And it really depends on post-production because sometimes people want to stop and kind of, rephrase something. Sometimes people, there are pauses in between. And so this could impact the post production. And so I would say that it can vary, but I would say at least 8 hours because there's script writing involved. So I forget sometimes all the little nitty-gritty things that are involved. And when you start tallying up all those minutes, it does add up, and hours, it adds up.
Yeah, and in
Awesome.
terms of finding the participants as well, yeah, for us it was a little easier because those were the people we knew or our participants knew and helped us invite them. But yeah, if that scenario you might not necessarily have a lot of connections, that certainly you should consider that work of reaching out to people, you know, building relationship because oftentimes you cannot expect someone to agree right away, but having that allocating that time to build the connection. So yeah, that does add up for sure. So it's hard to quantify, but something for us to keep in mind for sure.
Mhm. I think it also depends on the equipment, especially when you're recording a podcast virtually. Not everyone's going to have the same equipment. And so that will also impact in post-production as well. So there might be additional, editing that may need to take place in order to produce a high quality, episode.
Awesome. That's definitely a lot to consider. And I know, as people are thinking of podcasting as a form of knowledge translation, knowing sort of roughly, how much time, they can expect is really helpful. So we do have some other questions in the chat. So, and I'll, go through them sequentially. So we have a question from Paula. What have you included in your podcast evaluation plan? How do you measure its success?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Paula. I think as someone who was new to this medium, I wasn't necessarily aware of the importance of developing an evaluation plan. I am I am actually a program evaluator. That's the other role that I have. And so I am very interested in measuring something that is less tangible. Like Anu mentioned, I am yes, downloads and listens are important, but for me, the qualitative component would be more important because of the nature of the work. Like I'm more interested in understanding what are the takeaways, like what can you do with this information in your practice as a city staff. What change can you make in terms of the communication, in terms of things the way you're engaging with people. So I think that will be an ongoing work for me to actually connect with people and collect that sort of data. But yeah, from Anu's perspective, I'm sure she would be focusing more on some of the quantitative pieces and bringing that all together. I think will help us understand the long-term impact of this work.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So our next question is from James. So James says, you mentioned that YouTube is the dominant platform for podcast. Does this mean that podcasts should include video in addition to audio? Is there still demand for podcasts that are audio only? Can you create an audio only podcast with a simple still image for YouTube?
Great questions. Great questions. So, yes, I mentioned that YouTube is it becoming the dominant platform for podcasts, but that does not mean that, Spotify and, other platforms like Apple do not or are not favorable. What we're just seeing is that YouTube is the platform that people are going to the most. So there is still a place for audio podcasts. I'll get to video in a second. So for myself, even though video podcasts have become extremely popular, and yes, many people do prefer that. But it's interesting because even for those who may access a video podcast, they may not physically be watching the screen. They may just have it on in the background. And so really they're listening to the podcast audibly. And so I would say absolutely 100% there is a definite market for audio only. I only produce audio podcasts, but I have thought about, creating video podcasts. And in terms of the images on YouTube, there are few different ways you could create visuals on YouTube. I'm still learning myself a little bit about that because I have a new podcast that I've just launched recently, and I want to transfer it and my other previous ones to YouTube. So I believe that there are some people who just have a still image or maybe like a slideshow that kind of runs in the background, but it's definitely something that can be done. And what I appreciate is that it is absolutely free because a lot of these other platforms, depending on which one you upload your, podcast onto, there are fees attached to it. So I like the fact that, YouTube is a completely a free platform to use. It takes a little bit of time to get your head around it, but yeah, it's a good one.
Awesome. So I want to give space for anyone who has any additional questions. And I will say really quickly, so our host today, Shoshana, she has put a few things in the chat that I want to just quickly draw your attention to. So there is an evaluation link that we would love for you all to fill out so that we have some feedback on today's session. And then as a reminder, the recording and other supplemental materials will be posted to our website by next week. So those links are included in our chat. And just opening the floor for any other questions that you all may have for our presenters for today. Thank you, Shannon. I do agree. It's really pretty artwork. Any other questions? I do have one other question. Sorry, I was thinking of these as you all were presenting. So if you all were to pitch podcast over other sort of dissemination tactics like a video or an infographic, what would you all say is sort of like the top pro or the benefit of podcast over some of the other dissemination tactics?
You want me to tackle that first, Althea?
Yeah, go for it.
Because we've talked about it a little bit. So I love the fact that podcasts are so accessible. You can listen to it on your commute to work or anywhere else you may be going. If you're going for a walk, you can have it in the background while you're multitasking and doing other things. So just the fact that it has that level of accessibility. And what I love about podcasts as well is something that Althea mentioned when we heard the first sound clip of audiophile is you get to really hear the emotions and passion that is linked to or that associates to a person's viewpoint or whatever they're communicating. It just doesn't translate the same way I feel when you're reading something. So I really enjoy hearing that passion that comes out in people's and the emotions that come out in people's voices.
Yeah, but also obviously having the captions available. I think we spent quite a bit of time cleaning up so that was part of post-production work, making sure that they're embedded and they are part of the final product. So absolutely, I think I'm sure it has limitation. I think I'm open to other ways of sharing knowledge, but as I've engaged in this work with Anu, I think I definitely appreciated the ability to dive into certain topics in more depth. And so maybe step away from that traditional way of, even what I did today, sharing, findings, sharing a bit of methodology findings, but kind of stepping away from that and developing the topic further. So.
So, yeah, I agree. I think podcasts are great. I think there's so many opportunities in our day-to-day life where we can't physically look at something, whether it's driving or cooking or something like that. But it's nice that you want to kind of still be entertained in some way. So, like having a podcast is great because you could put that on and just listen while you're doing other things. So, I think it's a really good avenue to engage with people, to share findings or share other information. So. Alrighty, so I'm just kind of scanning the chat just to see if any folks have any last minute questions. And if anyone who attended our presentation today, if you have questions for our presenters and you want their information, they have put it in the chat. But then also if you navigate to our website and to our webcast page for this particular webcast, we have their contact information there as well. And I just want to say thank you again to our presenters. This was a great presentation, really knowledgeable about podcasts. And I think you all provided some really tangible things that people can take away if they're interested in starting a podcast as well. And again, if folks could complete our evaluation just to, provide any feedback that you may have regarding this presentation, that would be wonderful. And so with that, I will go ahead and just pause for any other questions. And do our presenters have any final closing thoughts?
No, thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so I think we'll go ahead and start closing this presentation out. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.